Well, that's great, Mara. Now I think we got about 25 minutes left in today's session. So we welcome questions from the audience. If there are some of you who want to join in on this conversation, we can invite you as well. So please go ahead, ask questions. Hi, Robert.
Hi. Yes, this is actually very impressive. And it gives me hope that the new people taking over the world, you young folks, are actually going to make a difference. I found the letter which the principal of Brown University wrote and read it. And in fact, I did put a comment on this ClimateX comment pages on that. It is quite fascinating. I mean, it speaks in positive tones, but it's obviously very cautious. And although the political situation in the UK is rather different from in the US, I have found similarities. You know, here we have a central parliament and members of parliament, and the country is divided into areas, each of which has an assigned MP according to, you know, how people voted in that area. So I have, from time to time, written to my MP on these issues of anxiety about climate change and so on. And I get back letters, probably not even as good as that. They're very polite, they're very concerned. They say, we're dealing with it, but of course, you know, etc., all these other things. And we can't, the equivalent of we can't divest from coal or something like that. And what's fascinating me is, did you feel that that letter had a tone change which gave you hope, or did you feel it was just a letter which was, you know, so far and that's it? And then before I just pass it back to you, the other thing, probably I have to be careful what I say, but I've become really anxious about President Trump. It does seem that there's a sizable population, it's in the UK as well as in the US, who don't even want to listen so that they can ask a question to which they can get a reasonable answer. Did you find some way in this listening exercise that you were doing, did you find some way to work around that, to bring more people in? In other words, not just you know, fellow believers, so to speak, but those who were skeptical or on the other side. Did you find you can bring them in? Maybe, in fact, by not focusing just on climate change, but focusing on health issues and other things like that. I'll pass that back to you now.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the response from the president of Brown University, so this project did start out after Brown refused to divest from coal. And I think I see the hope there, not necessarily in the president changing tone, but in the fact that they were forced to respond at all. In acknowledging that every institution needs to take on climate change as an issue, something that they need to engage with. And in the movement itself, which the movement itself created this moment where really bold action was possible. And for the other, talking about how do you bring in people, we did not engage with climate denial at all in this process. And I think that kind of that's what you have to do. But by not framing this as just a climate issue or an environmental issue, we were actually able to pass the same targets that we had in the Global Marine Solutions Act, along with a more ambitious bill, which included adaptation, which seems counterintuitive. But as you were saying, it's because we didn't focus on this as just an environmental issue, that we had broad support from others in the community who maybe don't necessarily, it's not that they deny climate change, but don't see climate change as the most pressing issue for their community. And so actually, at least publicly, the only opposition we had in the first round of hearings was from the Realtors Association and from the American Oil Institute, or the American Petroleum Institute. And that opposition kind of faded out. The other opposition that was mentioned was from environmental groups who wanted more ambitious targets. And those were, of course, the people who we had relationships with and worked very closely with. And I think it was useful to have that movement that was saying we need more, that this isn't enough here. Yeah, so Robert says, could you mention things you wanted that you did not get? And that's a question that I also want to present to everybody here to see if we can have more of a conversation about. So I'll throw some of the ideas out there. But I'd like, yeah, while I'm talking, maybe think about how climate change and the fossil fuel industry affects your community, and what adaptation to climate change might look like in where you're living, communities that you've been to, where you come from. Right, so in terms of what we wanted that we didn't get, I think some of the big things were more specific plans about how adaptation would be carried out. I mentioned that this extra clause in the Homeless Bill of Rights that one of our coalition partners had been interested in did not end up happening. Or did not end up being in the original bill, which signals that while the state did commit to working on adaptation to climate change, they didn't commit to working in particular with certain vulnerable populations. Another way that that manifested was we had actually written specifically in the bill that as agencies prepared their reports about how they would address climate change, that these reports should have information disaggregated by race, geographic area, and income status. And that is something that did not make it into the final bill either. In terms of on the mitigation side, we had tried to increase the share of energy that was coming from renewable projects in the state. It's called, in technical terms, the Renewable Energy Standard. And we had hoped to increase the rate at which the percentage of the energy in the state was coming from renewable energy. Yeah, increase the rate at which that would be increased. We would increase our share of renewable energy. There were some changes to building codes in terms of energy efficiency that did not make it in. And I think one really important thing that we tried to work on, so energy efficiency is a really good way to decrease carbon emissions, since about 20% of the carbon emissions in the state of Rhode Island, at least, and this is true generally in New England and these more temperate areas, come from energy. Increasing energy efficiency is great. It helps families save money on energy costs, and it reduces the amount of energy we're using in general. And one of the barriers to expanding that is that renters generally don't have the right to make changes without their landlord's agreement, and landlords can delay allowing these to happen. And so even if there are a lot of state and utility funded programs that make it easy to do weatherization or to improve energy efficiency, renters and people who don't own property can't take advantage of those programs. And so we had tried to write a fix in for that as well.
So Zheng Wen has a question about ocean acidification, if you want to address that.
Yeah, so I think there's no way to stop ocean acidification without reducing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere.
You may want to explain a little bit about the chemistry of how carbon leads to acidification. You know, I'm sure there are people who would be interested.
Sure. So as carbon dioxide gas in the atmosphere dissolves in ocean water, and as it dissolves in ocean water, it can be a neutral compound or it can be an acidic compound. And how acidic the carbon in the ocean, or the carbon dioxide, which how acidic that becomes when it's in the ocean depends on how much there is. So as there's more is going to, it's going to be a more acidic molecule, and there'll just be more. Yeah, so makes the ocean water more acidic, and that kind of impacts on coral reefs and fish and phytoplankton that may have shells made out of calcium carbonate, basically anything that has calcium carbonate, which is then going to react with be degraded by the acidity. And I think, yeah, so when people talk about things like geoengineering that's going to block sun rather than mitigating carbon emissions, that means that we're not addressing something like ocean acidification at all. Yeah, so it's an important thing to continue to talk about.
A couple more questions from Robert, I think, if you want to take a look at that.
Yeah, is there a fuller write-up? So we have a website, resilientri.org, that includes some of the research we did, and was looking at it last night that I don't think it actually has a link to our original bill, but that's something that I'm planning on adding now, if people are going to be looking at it again. Yeah, during the campaign, we didn't want to be confusing about what the current legislation was, but now I can put the historic copy up. It's also linked to in news articles. I think it's in the Environment Rhode Island. Or the EcoRI article that I linked to has a link to the bill as well.
Another question out there.
This is from Kurt. I assume it says, it seems that part of the adaptation legislation and funding is creating a recognition that you can pay now or pay a lot later in post-disaster recovery. Do you see other impacts besides sea level rise and hurricanes having sufficient immediate impact? A drought in the Southwest, severe weather changes in the ag-heavy Midwest. Yes, definitely. I think that we focus on extreme weather a lot as answers, and yeah, so two answers. One is that when we're focusing on extreme weather, I think it's important, people say this about Hurricane Katrina in particular, that it's not just a natural disaster, it's a human-caused disaster, which is to say that the areas of Katrina that were hardest hit were not necessarily the areas of Louisiana that were hardest hit were not necessarily the areas with the highest winds or the highest rains. They were the areas in which infrastructure failed, the people who were living there. And we saw the same thing in Rhode Island with the 2010 floods, that it was not the areas that got the most rain. It was the areas that didn't have the infrastructure, either for evacuation or for just high quality infrastructure that was going to be able to resist this flooding and these extreme rain events. And that was exacerbated, as I said, by the toxic conditions around. So that's one thing, that we could pay now or pay a lot later, but also the disinvestment from particular communities creates these disasters. Yeah, and the second part is, in addition to these types of infrastructure and industry challenges, I think the other part is the health challenges. And this is why the Department of Health report was particularly useful for us. So there are pollutants in air that are an issue, but also for people living next to fossil fuel projects and living next to these polluting industries, climate change, or at least the fossil fuel industry, is already having an effect. Another thing we talked about a lot is heat waves. So part of the adaptation, one of the main adaptation goals was to provide a way for people to cool that would not be increasing the amount of climate change. So that's something like providing centralized cooling centers, increasing the amount of community centers or libraries that have air conditioning, and increasing transportation out of the city, which, because cities are heat islands, so it's warmer when you're in a city. Because if you increase the amount of air conditioning overall, then you are increasing the amount of energy demand in an area. So instead, coming up with these collective solutions that allow people to alleviate these health problems. Yeah, and it goes along with the general focus on making sure that community health and public health are being supported throughout. Is really important to adaptation to climate change.
So have you been in doing field work the entire time that you've been at MIT, or have you been on campus as well?
I was on campus for my first semester, so
okay.
Last September.
So you've really gone from Brown to Chile with a 1 semester stopover.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I think it would be great for you to speak a little bit about what you think, or how you think the MIT community can contribute to the kind of issues that you worked on in Rhode Island.
Yeah, so I saw mention to the MIT Climate Action Plan as well. And I think one of the really important things when we talk about the MIT community, and this is what we're doing, is transferring the academic knowledge into action, but doing that in a way that's really accountable to the communities that this action will be supposedly benefiting. So that it's not just a transfer of academic knowledge, but that there's engagement from one side to the other. And so when we talked about community science, for example, that scientists can provide expertise, but we were saying that some of the projects are most effective when the community is asking for that expertise in the first place. But making these sorts of expertise more available. And I think one of the really disappointing things about the MIT Climate Action Plan was that there had been this really wonderful report prepared by a group from the MIT community, and that most of it was not implemented at all. And that can be, we saw at MIT how frustrating that was, that all of this work had been put into it, the community had spent so much time giving input and working on this project, just to have a lot of it not even pushed to the future, but that it seemed to be that there was no possibility of these ideas being realized at all. And I think we can take that and say, well, what if we're doing research in a community and we say, kind of give the hope that there are people interested, engaged, people with access to certain power and resources that we don't have, either funding or access to influential people. And rather than facilitating more access to this funding or influential people, just kind of taking that and keeping it kind of stuck as an academic project when it had this potential for the community.
So we have, it's not a question, but it's a thank you note from Zheng Wen, who says it's an amazing webinar. So thank you, Zheng Wen.
Thank you.
For saying that.
Yeah, and I hope we have room for more. I hope there are more questions, more conversation, and of course we can do that on the ClimateX forum afterwards as well.
We have time for at least 2 questions.
Yeah, do you have a few more questions?
There was one more question here in the tab. It says, so Davis has a question which I'm going to try to interpret as well as I can, which is, I mean, I think what he's asking is, do you look at pollution as a closed loop? So he says pollution gives birth to new kinds of bacteria and new life. So do you look for bacteria which eat pollution? So I guess this would be a kind of a biogeoengineering. Right?
Yeah, which is certainly not my expertise, but I know that there is research on that, looking at how microbes degrade oil and things like that. Yeah, when I'm talking about pollution, at least in this context, we're talking about how it's affecting the social system, how it's affecting different neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
But I think both are important, having access to the technology to solve the problems and to the political structure to solve the problem as well. You need both together.
I mean, we should note, and especially at a place like MIT, that social structures are also technologies, right? I mean, they
are, definitely.
So
yeah.
Technologies aren't just things that are robotic or the kinds of things that we normally associate MIT with, but also ways of organizing people and institutions.
Right.
So we got another question which says, do you see much climate action happening in Chile? Does it seem different than in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, the US?
I would say from what I've seen, there's less of a conversation about climate in particular, but there are these similar environmental conversations, especially having to do with dams, actually, about who has ownership over the land, who can have power about how these energy choices are being made, and how are these affecting communities. And a major difference is that Chile is not a major emitter of fossil fuels. So I think the US has a bigger climate movement, but that makes a lot of sense because the US is also one of the biggest polluters. And so they need that a huge amount of the responsibility lies within the US. But Chile is a signatory to the Paris Agreement and is making changes, things like making public transit run on renewable energy, and things like that as well. But that's been a difference, right? Being in a country responsible or as opposed to a country receiving the damages. And
I just wanted to add a twist to that, which is often in places where, especially where there's a lot of farming and there are rural communities that stand to lose a lot from climate change, they may still phrase their problem as one of access to land or water, and not necessarily in the climate sort of terminology.
Exactly.
Here.
Exactly. And that's really important to acknowledge.
Right. So, for example, Bangladesh is sadly going to lose a lot from climate change, but you will find Bangladeshi farmers talking about very basic access rights rather than climate action.
Right. Yeah. And kind of on that note, and before we close, I did want to take a moment to mention the important work going on at Standing Rock within the US. And so for those of you who aren't aware, it's a resistance movement to a pipeline project on an American Indian reservation in North Dakota. Yeah, and so this is just in the spirit of acknowledging importance of taking Indigenous leadership and anti-colonial leadership. I'm going to post a link here in the chat to get more involved in supporting the camps, but this is exactly what we've been talking about, that this is a climate project, but it's about so much more, about talking about who has access to land and to water and to these political decision-making structures.
Well, with that note of solidarity, it is 12:58, and I think it's as good an opportunity to thank Mara once again for your wonderful explanations and for the great work that you did in Rhode Island and are continuing to do now. Mara, any final thoughts?
That's all. Thank you all so much. And yeah, I hope we can continue this conversation.
Yeah, and if people want to reach you, I guess the ClimateX website is a great place, and yeah. Send in your comments.
That would be the best. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thanks a lot, Mara.
All right.
Thanks to everybody who came.
And next week we are back on Monday again, and it will be Katie Mulvaney. So next Monday at noon Eastern Time, United States. Thank you.